Hey, sorry if you tried to join the previous one. For some reason, my Mac did not like that one bit and slow to a crawl. So, hopefully, we can get the show on the road. So, just put out a tweet. Don't know why I've tagged Static twice on that. Okay, cool. So, basically, what I've been wanting for a while to do a talk or a sort of walk through building add-ons for Statmic. My background is in sort of HTML, CSS, PHP from the early 2000s. I first built a website back in 2000, I think it was, while I was on work experience. So um, it might have been 99, I can't remember. But anyway, by the by, I know, and even though it was that long ago, I can still remember how painful it was um, learning how to try and put pieces together. And even with really well written documentation, it can sometimes be a bit of a headache to try and get your head around things. So, what I wanted to do was basically walk through the very basics of um, building add-ons for Statamic. So I'm hoping that people can see this. Can everyone see this? I have no idea if people can see that. So I'm just going to double check and see whether I can see it, because I'm still relatively new to this. So I'm probably looking like a bit of an idiot right now, but oh well. Yep. Thanks, Jesse. Right. So let's have a look. So basically, there are a number of different types of add-ons that you can build for Statamic. They range from, if you look at the documentation, from things like tags. Tags are, I would say, 80% of the time, 90% of the time, going to be one of the tools that you reach for. Modifiers, field types, event listeners, commands, tasks, etc., etc. A lot of this is not going to mean much to you if you don't have very much experience with Laravel. You don't need to be an expert to be able to build add-ons for Statamic. Laravel knowledge will help, but basically, what I wanted to try and do was relate what a lot of this terminology is to what it actually means on the front end, as far as you would be concerned if you are somebody who primarily works with the Antlers templates or anything like that. So this is going to be a bit rough and ready because I have about half an hour. I can probably go through some bits and pieces, see what people think of this, if there's really any demand for sort of a bit more detail. But yeah, basically, as I said, tags, at least in my experience, are one of the things that you will reach for time and time again. But what is a tag? Well, a tag is literally what you write almost every single day when you're working with Statamic. So if we just take probably one of the more likely ones that you work with, which would be nav, because invariably most people will work with nav at some point. Nav is a bit of a special case in that it has some additional functionality, but I'm just actually thinking, is there possibly a better example? Maybe not. Anyway, so nav is the tag name, and effectively you have your from and your max depth, and these are parameters. So a tag can have any number of parameters, and they can be whatever you want. Um, Within reason. I guess there are probably some things that are reserved keywords, but I haven't ran into them. If you do, or if you know any, let me know. Basically, a tag is how the majority of people interact with. If you think about it as PHP but not having to write PHP, it's that's effectively what it is. It gives you a way to manipulate and output information from either your data on the website. Hey, Duncan. So it gives you a way of either putting it out as data or data from the website. So that could be something that's in your content folder. It could be a global. It also gives you the ability to output data potentially from an external source like an API. A weather API might be something you build if you have a client who has maybe either a hotel villa to let out, and you want to be able to show people what the weather's like there, or maybe what the weather's supposed to be like in the next week. You wouldn't necessarily have that data in Statamic, so you might look at building an add-on that has a tag for you to be able to output information from that API. Let's have a quick look. Modifiers. So, you've probably used a modifier. A modifier is a really simple way of manipulating the data on in a tag without having to do anything particularly complicated, at least on the front end. So, really good example of what a modifier is let's have a quick look for a relatively simple one. Replace. So you've obviously got this example here. Description would be your tag, as you can see here. And what happens is you've got your modifier and you pass through some data. Now, what I'll do is I'll look at going back through these at some point to basically relate it. But if you think about a tag is something that you want to output, something that might not be necessarily accessible straight away. A modifier is something that you want to do to that tag. Field types, not really relevant at the moment, unless you're looking at building a custom way of inputting data. Really good example of this is, I can't remember who developed it, but there's a character count field set, which is literally just extends the default text field, but gives you the ability to add a character limit with some visual feedback. Event listeners give you the ability to do something when an event is triggered. So that might be quite abstract while you're thinking about it, but a really good example of this is when the event for the menu being loaded, or the control panel being loaded, is fired. So Statamic, every time it loads a page, will fire a series of events. One of those is telling the system that the control panel is loaded and ready to be interacted with. You can add a menu item to the side menu. You've also got commands. Commands are a way of giving people the ability to run custom artisan commands, which in Statamic parlance are please commands. Tasks are something that I've not really dealt with too much. They are effectively a way of automating cron jobs. It's something I need to look at for something that I'm building in the near future. Service providers are something that you probably won't use too much unless you are really diving down into sort of the underlyings of Statamic, where it starts getting very close to the Laravel layer. But basically, this gives you a way of bootstrapping certain functions. APIs are a way of giving other add-ons the ability to um, interact with some core functionality. If you've used Composer or if you've used npm, think of it as like a Composer or an npm package within Statamic. It gives you the ability to uh, build an add-on that doesn't really do much by itself, but allows other add-ons to sort of make use of that. Obviously, in the documentation here, there is an example of a way of giving people points for doing certain actions. A really good example of something that I'm working on at the moment is hooking in the SMS tool, one of the companies that I work for, into Statamic. So if people want to build add-ons, maybe it's a uptime monitor, or maybe that there's a text message that gets sent out when somebody submits a form, that type of thing. It'll be able to give you the ability to very easily hook into that without having to completely rewrite the PHP class to work with Statamic. Widgets are basically a really nice way of displaying information in the control panel. I skipped controllers. So controllers are think of a way of describing this. One of the things that's probably important to bear in mind with Statamic being based on Laravel is that it's based on the model view control panel. Now, if you've never come across that before, I would probably recommend looking at signing up to Laracas and going through the PHP Basics course that Jeffrey has. Model View Controller is something that is used almost everywhere within Laravel apps, and Statamic is no different. Basically, models are representations of the data that is stored within your website, whether that's in the flat file system or whether it's in a database. And it gives that data or functions. So simple things like saying that this data is related to this, or this data can belong to a user, is where you define that type of thing. A view is probably the easiest part of the entire process to understand, especially if you're coming from the front end. That is what you see and you interact with. So in Statamic, that is typically antlers. Within Laravel, that would blade. And then you've got controllers. And controllers effectively sit between the two. A view may say, I've got this information from a form. I need you to do whatever you need to do with it to get it into the model. And the controller will take that information and it will shape it and it will pass it to the model to be stored. Or it might be that the model says, I've got this data, can you pass it to the front end? So controls are something that you will use when you start getting to more complicated add-ons, particularly ones that have a lot of pages that are within the control panel. Or potentially where you have forms on the front end that are not going through the standard Statamic form handler. A really good example of this would be, let's say you have a newsletter sign up, or you have a marketing automation platform that you want to integrate. You would potentially look at using a controller to handle that data rather than trying to wrangle the static form class. Settings are not technically an add-on by themselves. This is just a way of storing configuration information for an add-on. One thing that might be a little bit different for you if you're very much used to working with the YAML front matter in Antlers is that in Antlers you would define a tag or a key within the data, and then you give it a type of, let's say, text. You then give it a display of, maybe heading and you might give it an instruction of this is a heading. You can use it to override the page title if you want. You don't do that with add-ons. With add-ons, you would create a separate settings file where you reference the key, and you would put things like display, instructions, and any other localizable content in there. So that basically will give you the ability to have a way of translating your add-on very easily without necessarily having to worry about going back. And finally, filters. Filters are a way of allowing you to manipulate effectively collections. So a really good example of that is where you want to say, give me a collection where it equals something. So give me a collection where things are published. So that might be give me a blog where everything is published. And you might be thinking, where am I going to use that? There are going to be times that that type of functionality is very useful. You might even need to create your own custom ones based on various different example. Sadly, I doubt you would ever use the example that is in the actual documentation where you're trying to find things that have bacon in it. But yeah, that is partly what I want to go through, is to look at the actual documentation, work through those examples, and then look at sort of more real world examples of where you might use that particular type of add-on. So let's start with something really simple and go through the tag documentation. So as the documentation says, the tag consists of several parts. You have the name, which is the name of the add-on. You have the second bit, which is a method. Now, as I said, in object-oriented PHP, you have a situation where you have a class. So a class is effectively a wrapper around a bunch of functions that have have some form of commonality between them. So they would typically be related to a single purpose. Now, in object-oriented PHP, a function within a class is known as a method, which is why we have this particular bit here. And lastly, we have a parameter. So like what we looked at with nav, where nav has from and max depth, those are both parameters, and they give you a very easy way of passing data from the view into your add-on. Now that could be for configuration purposes, that could be passing information from the context of the page. So the context of the page is just data that is available to the page, and then either outputting it, manipulating it, using that information to do something, and then returning other information to the user. So as the documentation says, you can actually have tags in pairs. So entries listing, the tag is entries, the method is listings, and folder is a parameter. Now, entries is a core function. I believe I might be mistaken there. But basically the idea is that you would say, I want you to give me all the entries listings, or I want you to look in the entries add-on for the listings function or method. I want you to basically give that method this information for this particular purpose. This would effectively, in your entries add-on, you might have a listing where you basically say, go and grab all the entries and list all of them out for anything within the blog folder, and then return a title. The example class is a very, very simple thing. You can see here you have your example add-on, your method, and this is what it returns. Thinking about it, that is probably somewhere that the documentation could be improved. So just to run this through really, really quickly, the way that you would effectively call that, and this is where I think possibly we could look at improving the documentation just a tiny bit to make that clearer, is you would have example add-on my method, and if you were to do that, that would return on the page. This is not very exciting, but it works. So as you can see, it takes camel case. I believe, I'd have to double check, but I'm 99% sure that when you have a camel cased add-on name, it outputs it as underscores within antlers. But yeah, basically that's literally how that works. It's very easy to generate a tags class, which we'll come back to in a second and we will go through, but just a couple of things to go through. Returning a string will return the string. Thankfully, that is kind of what you'd want it to do. Each public method in your tags is exposed as a template tag. Now what this means is, if we just get rid of this, we have another public function. Let's say this one is called another turn something else. Whereas, like what we said before, you would have example add-on my method. How this will work is it would instead be another. However, where this differs is, let's say you have a function that you want to have in the tag. It's not really worth spitting out into a different file. And let's say we just want to manipulate something very, very quickly before we return it. So we have a private function. We want to say something. And let's say you take so let's say you've got another, and you have trying to think of what we could do. Right, it's not a great example of this, but just for the sake of getting it through, we have param equals, and I'll explain in 2 seconds what this is. This get param foo. So we just want to assign it to a variable, and then within object-oriented PHP, again, you to call another function within that particular method, or within something that is within call within use, you can call this get param. Get param is a way of accessing this type of thing. So another example would be name equals Ben, and you could literally go name, and that's literally, you know, a good example of how that works. That equals that. So whatever the parameter that you want to get is, that equals that will equal that, and will equal that. In fact, actually, sorry, I'll equal that because it's lowercase. Let's say we've done that, and then we want to return, let's just say return the name. You wouldn't necessarily do that type of thing because you wouldn't necessarily call that type of thing. but you want to return, let's say hello. Is it plus or is it dot? Sorry, I've been working between JavaScript and PHP today, so I always get confused with the concatenation symbol. Let's say name, we'll just go name equals this. What do we call that? Something. Right. So basically, this will say run this method, that method, and it will return the name. So in this case, it would return hello Ben. Now, that is one thing to consider. However, if you attempted to do this, example add-on something, that won't work. And the reason why is because it's a private method. It's not exposed to the to Antlers. Index method maps to the single part of the tag. Now this is worth bearing in mind. If you just want to give people the ability to output this, you can go public function index, return, this is the default method. Okay, so that would effectively return, if you did that, you would get that text. That's what you'd get. So that can be really useful if you are doing something like a Google Analytics tag output, or if you just need to output a very simple bit of data. That can be really useful for that type of thing. This is more useful if you have a tag or an add-on where you want to be able to give people the ability to do multiple things. What else have we got? What are the other things? Your class name must be in the following format: add-on names.tag, which is what we were talking about before, where you've got the tag name followed by tags, and that kind of format follows everywhere else. So let's say you would never do it within a tag file, but let's just say you have example add-on API, and we were building an API. An API add-on, it would be tags, API, and that would be basically API instead of tags. But we will get rid of that so we don't confuse things. But yeah, basically, as we were saying as well before, it has to be camel case in the add-on, and it will output as snake case in template. So as I said, example add-on would output as example add-on underscore, and these are all things that contribute up very easily, and you kind of need to make sure that you're telling anybody who's using your add-on. So as it says, you have the ability to work with input. So there's two different things. We've seen get param. Now, get param, there's a couple of other types. You could have another one. Let's just keep in true static style and say bacon true, which is of course always the answer. You might have get paramble bacon, which would return true. I keep instinctively going to save it. That will give you a Boolean return. I think if you were to put that in as 1 or 0, I haven't tried that for a very long time. I'm pretty sure it returns true or false based on 0 being false and 1 being true. And you can also return an integer. So this can be really useful for when you need to return a particular data type. There are going to be times where APIs or where your methods require the data to be in a particular format. Of course, thanks to some of the changes that have come in with PHP 7, you can cast types fairly easily. But obviously, if you know you're going to need it as a boolean, try to use getParam bool. You also have a couple of other ways of doing things. There is the get let's say global. Let's just call it global, and this get config global. So where this works is if you think about an add-on, you maybe have a setting within your add-on that you want to be able to be accessible from anywhere in the add-on. This is how you would set that. So that might be if you are building an add-on that sends messages to a particular email, you might have a default email or a single email that you want that to fire off to. That'd be a way of doing that. So you might say email equals email address. Another example, I'm just going to put space between this. A really common example would of course be API keys. Now you could get a little bit more complicated with this in terms of using environment variables, and obviously I would strongly advise using environment variables rather than saving stuff into your files, especially using version control. But basically they're the two main ways of getting data. So getParam gets it from the tag, and get config returns it from the actual data. Unfortunately, I am going to have to shoot. However, I will try and pick this up in the next couple of days. Let me know what everyone thinks, if it's something that you're interested in, and we'll go from there. All right, speak to you soon. Bye.